Hello and welcome back to the Coking.com channel. My name is Evan Hyde and I will be sharing with you today's video, which is part of our Coker Essential series, where we are going to be talking about what's important about the coke drum outlet temperature. It's probably one of the most important variables in the unit in terms of safety, reliability, and overall profitability of the unit to pay attention to. So let's dig into that a little bit. So I know this is a video, this is a one-way street, but I wanted to put a poll question out there, put it in your mind. We're going to come back to this in a little while. What is the quenched drum outlet vapor DOV TI temperature indication normally for your unit? So just file that one away in there and we're going to come back and revisit that in a few minutes. So the drum overhead vapor DOV temperature is, as I said already, one of the most important variables to pay attention to in the unit because it drives the overall yield and conversion in the coke drum. So this temperature is significantly lower than what it is leaving the fired heater, and that's because of the fact that the coking and cracking reactions are in fact endothermic, which means as the reactions are happening, it's sucking energy out of the process because it's consuming the energy by breaking the molecules apart. This is what we mean when we say an exothermic reaction. We cover a lot more about that in the chemistry and overall morphology of the delayed coker sections as part of the Coker Essentials. Go check out those videos separately. But let's talk about the delta T, the DTs across various steps along this chain, because they all are a little bit different and they tell you something different as well. So let's start first with the coil outlet temperature. So that's the one immediately out of the furnace. So normally it's right on the first elbow coming out of the furnace before it heads up. There are other places for coil outlet temperatures to exist, but let's just take that as the base case for now. There's often also a combined coil outlet temperature, where the passes all come together, move into the transfer line, and there's another thermal well right there. And the distance between the coil outlet and that combined thermal well is generally only on the order of 5 to 10 meters. It's relatively close apart. And let's say that first delta T is going to be number 1. Now, there's also another delta T where we'll talk about the transfer line delta T. So this is from the coil outlet temperature all the way to the drum inlet temperature. So you might see this called drum inlet temperature. And that is the transfer line DT, and that can be substantially higher. Let's call that one number 2. And then you have a third DT, which goes to the unquenched drum outlet vapor temperature. So that one's going to be number 3. And then you have quench oil that's generally injected on the vapor line. We'll talk about that in a minute. And you have the DT between the unquenched and the quenched. This is number 4. So what are those values in reality? So let's talk about coil outlet temperature to combined coil outlet temperature, number 1. That's usually on the order of maybe 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Apologies for all my Celsius friends out there. That's somewhere on the order of 2 to 4, maybe 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. So number 2, this is the transfer line delta T, and everyone loves to talk about this one. We'll have a whole separate other video talking about the transfer line DT and all the things that go into it, but let's just say for now it's in the order of 15 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit for a variety of reasons that we're not going to cover in this video. 3 is the biggest DT, because as you might expect, that's where the longest residence time is. That's where all the reaction can happen and you can really suck the energy out. So that delta T is somewhere in the order of 80 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere in that neighborhood. And then 4, it depends on how much you're quenching the values, but that can be on the order of 20 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So those are some typical numbers. There's a lot of variation across the industry in these numbers, but that just kind of gives you a sense of scale. Now, if you're monitoring your unit, one of the things that we always highly recommend is that people trend these delta Ts over time, because they tell you a lot of information that's a little bit beyond the scope of this introductory video that we'll cover in some more advanced training that we have available at our website. So let's move on to the third bullet, which is The drum unquenched TI is the best indication of what's happening in the drum. And why that is the fact that all those reactions are happening, consuming energy, and you have antifoam going in, and you have steam going in there, you have all the cracking happening. If things are kind of going awry, shall we say, and again, that's, how those go awry is a longer discussion. But if they're going awry, the unquenched drum TI is going to tell you first. However, it is also the most likely one to become fouled and dirty, therefore indicating a lower temperature than what it is in reality. So we'll talk about how we keep them clean in a few minutes, but just keep in mind that paying attention to the unquenched drum TI is sometimes underrated, but it's something that will help you if you do pay attention to it. You may not always necessarily believe it to the decimal point, but it's a good idea directionally to have a good awareness of what's happening there. And because it does foul, it is important to keep this thermal well clean. The thermal wells of the drum inlet, both of the drum vapor temperatures can be cleaned online with no process impact after the drum has been safely cut and isolated. So keep in mind that if you are getting some squirrely numbers out of these instruments, it is possible to pull out the thermal well, give it a nice clean, put it back in there, see if reality is the same. So let's talk about where we put these drum vapor TIs. Now, there is some variation across the industry. We're always striving to put it in a location and with an insertion depth that keeps it as clean as possible. You're never going to keep it clean, but we want to keep it as clean as possible. So let's start with the first and simplest location is the unquenched drum outlet TI. That oftentimes is in the vertical piece of pipe coming directly out of the drum, inserted somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 6 inches. Older styles would be inserted half the diameter of that pipe there. That's, in my opinion, a little bit too much because it becomes a bit of a coat catcher. You kind of have to find the happy medium there at what's the right insertion length for it to read correctly but also not become a coat catcher. So that's where the third point really comes in. Look at the turnaround, inspection history, maintenance history to decide, is the insertion length right for your location? So that's the unquenched drum TI. Relatively straightforward position. The quenched TI is something that there's a lot of variation across the industry. So when I talk about the quench oil, that's this blue line coming into the drum right there, or the drum vapor line, excuse me. And the most common location is the red thermal well location that I have indicated on the diagram. This is some in the neighborhood of, let's call it, it's in the horizontal pipe immediately off the coke drum, and it's typically in the middle of that run, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 7 pipe diameters downstream of the gas oil injection location. This gives it good mixing time, good chance to reach equilibrium to get a good temperature reading. Now, there are some sites, especially newer ones, where they pay attention to this value for optimization purposes, and they've gone with 2 thermal wells. So this is the purple example that we have there on the diagram. The purple ones, anytime you see 2 of the same indication, it means it's very important and or unreliable. That's still, the purple is still in that horizontal piece of pipe before you turn coming off the cutting deck. Now, there are a number of sites that have had fouling issues with that horizontal pipe, so they've chosen to relocate their quenched drum TIs either up near the cutting deck, around the corner of the elbow, and this is something that can be done at the cutting deck elevation or slightly below, or there are some sites that have actually spent some time to put the thermal well actually down at the switch deck or very close to it, because they claim that this keeps it cleaner and gives them a more reliable number. Now, why do I bring this forward? Because it's really important when you're benchmarking yourself and you're comparing yourself across the industry. If I say my delta T for my drum vapor quenching is 30 degrees and yours says yours is 15, that could be an indication of where these thermal wells are placed. So there needs to be a bit of a sensitivity there. Just be aware that they're not all in precisely the same location. let's talk about how we control the drum vapor line quench. Now, there are 3 strategies here. The first one, I don't even have it on the list because it's not terribly recommended. It is the flow only control, which is, put it at 5,000 barrels per day or 50 meters cubed per hour or whatever, set it and forget it. And, this can work in some older sites that aren't trying very hard to optimize this situation, but that's generally not recommended. What's more recommended is either an absolute temperature to control the absolute temperature at that quenched TI, or to look at the delta T between the unquenched and the quenched TI. So some examples of that might be, I'm going to control on cascade to flow for my drum quench oil, to a target of 398 degrees Celsius. Put that in the controller, set point 398, hit enter, it will adjust the flow to target that. And that's a reasonable strategy because, as we said, the downstream quenched TI tends to stay cleaner than the unquenched TI. So people who employ this strategy say that I don't necessarily believe the upstream one all the time, not to the point to where I'm willing to base a control scheme off of it. So the flip side of that is to control to a delta T. So for example, if you're running your drum outlet temperature at, let's say, 800, and you want to have a delta T of 30 degrees, then this TI is going to be running at 770 degrees Fahrenheit. So the delta T is nice because that allows you to really kind of dial in the quench oil, minimize the quench oil, minimize the recycle to some extent, and really try to optimize that probably heavy gas oil or blow-down oil that's being used as quench oil to really optimize the unit. Now, obviously the downside is if that upstream thermocouple is becoming fouled and you're quenching to a delta T, you can be potentially over quenching as well. So there are pros and cons to both of these strategies. There's really no right answer. We just want to make sure that you're aware of the variations and what is potentially out there. So we kind of kicked it off at the start of the video with what is your quenched drum vapor temperature normally. I will tell you now that most people in the world are running somewhere in the 780 to 760 range. That's 415 to 404 Celsius. Now there are people that are higher than that and there are people who are lower than that. But when you're working higher with that, obviously you can reduce recycle, but you're kind of playing with that fouling potential for your drum vapor lines. And if you're working lower than that, you may be putting a little bit more oil into the system as recycle than you really necessarily need. So it really depends on what's going on in your unit. You can optimize that. I'm just kind of letting you know what's quote-unquote normal. So that brings us to the end of today's Kocher Essential Series, what's important about the drum outlet temperature. Hopefully you learned something and you'll come back and visit us again at our channel or on our website, koking.com. We have a ton of great information out there and we would love to have you. Thanks.